are hurtling toward the day when climate change could be irreversible.
Rising sea levels already altering this nation's coast.
China's capital is choking in its worst pollution of the year.
5% of species will become extinct.
Sea levels rising, glaciers melting.
If we do nothing, the picture of the world is one of absolute devastation.
There's no convincing scientific evidence for man-made climate change.
We're spewing 162 million tons of human-caused global warming pollution into it every single day, as if this is an open sewer.
Satellite data demonstrate in the last 17 years, there's been zero warming, none whatsoever. It's why, you remember how it used to be called global warming? And then magically the theory changed to climate change?
Sure.
The reason is it wasn't warming, but the computer models still say it is, except the satellites show it's not.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
Drill, baby, drill. Drill, baby, drill.
You can have the best capitalism and global capitalism in the world, but if people are dead, they're dead. It's over.
Enough is enough. The world is at a breaking point. Catastrophic climate change, biosphere collapse, and a global energy crisis have been met with apathy, denial, and despair.
It is going to take everything we know and love.
Like clockwork, our corporate overlords present us with two untenable options. Submit to an Orwellian itinerary of energy rationing and population control, or ride the status quo into the abyss. Both sides are right, and both sides are wrong, which means both sides are missing a critical piece of the puzzle.
Since the early 2000s, we have seen an increasing number of unauthorized and or unidentified aircraft or objects in military-controlled training areas and training ranges and other designated airspace.
Some of them appeared to remain stationary in winds aloft, move against the wind, maneuver abruptly, or move at considerable speed without discernible means of propulsion. That's pretty intriguing.
I think I would, without discernible means of propulsion, I would say that we're not aware of any adversary that can move an object without discernible means of propulsion.
The phrase unidentified flying object is a deliberately obfuscating term. What it really is an alternative energy and propulsion device. This is the real reason for the secrecy. These technologies, if they were disclosed, would end fossil fuels, pollution, and poverty overnight, and usher in a new era of abundance, freedom, and peace. Instead, they have been kept secret for over 100 years. Dr. Stephen Greer, the world's leading expert on UFOs and extraterrestrial intelligence, has been advising presidents and heads of state for 30 years on the urgency of the situation. We don't have much time left.
What is this lost century? This lost century is literally 100 years, more than that now, of technologies that have existed that have vanished. I mean, I was just recently in a meeting in Washington with the people who manage the black budget of the United States. They have no access to this material because between the late 1800s and now, the ingenious inventions and sciences that could have moved us off that extinction level path that we're on have all been ruthlessly suppressed, confiscated. And the only way that's going to change, it is not going to change in Washington. It is not going to change in a large corporation, unlikely. It's going to change by us, the people doing it. So it's about us. Let's look at this. You know what this is?
Hey, this is a fucking drone, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the ASA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. Look at that thing, dude.
This is an alternative energy and propulsion device. These are things that have existed all the way back into the 60s. But the one that they call the Tic Tac here off the coast of San Diego, the white one, looked very much like this. These have been made by the Lockheed Skunk Works. And my favorite letter of all time, the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works, Ben Rich, look at the date on it, 1986. It was an answer to a letter someone wrote and says, are these UFOs man-made or extraterrestrial? He says, many of our man-made UFOs are really unfunded opportunities, meaning if it was released for public use, it'd be an enormous industry. Every meeting I go in Washington, I said, see that thing you guys are all talking about? That's Lockheed Skunk Works.
They have left us behind, and everything we see out in our world today is absolutely a construct. It's an absolute construct. The internal combustion engines are obsolete. The nuclear power plants are obsolete. The coal-fired plants are obsolete. We have the wind generators, those are obsolete. The solar power, it's all obsolete. If we could follow the gravity research that the contractors and research institutions have been doing, we could see that bright future as well.
So a lot of people say, well, how is this thing moving? There's no fuel on board. There's no nuclear power plant. There's no jets and no rockets. Well, way back in the 40s, Dr. Casimir, he predicted, and later it was proven in the 50s, what's called the zero-point energy field.
Zero-point energy, or what Nikola Tesla called radiant energy, is the most profound and transformative gift that the quantum world offers us. The seemingly empty vacuum of space is actually a roiling sea of virtual particles fluctuating in and out of existence, and all those fluctuations require energy. If we could tap into this energy source, we would unlock a virtually unlimited reservoir of clean, free energy. Extraterrestrial spacecraft are known to harness zero-point energy.
The U.S. scientists' understanding of what this was. It was an energy device that used zero-point energy. That's what they referred it to as zero-point energy. And it was connected in such a manner that this device could power, from a very small flashlight or a very small watch up to a city. And power was determined by what the demand on it was.
The implications of free energy go far beyond bringing monthly electric bills to zero or running a car without gasoline. Most of the cost of making anything, from growing food to building a skyscraper, is the energy of pulling raw materials out of the ground, shipping, processing, shipping again, and so on. If the cost of energy goes to zero, the cost of agriculture and manufacturing becomes negligible. Other critical solutions, like water desalination to end drought or air purification, both of which are prohibitively expensive due to energy costs, would suddenly become viable in a free energy paradigm. A new world where humans live in perfect harmony with nature is possible within our lifetimes. But this would mean the end of oil, gas, and coal, as well as the centralized power grid and the global macroeconomic system, which will stop at nothing to protect the hundreds of trillions of dollars at stake.
The consequences of keeping all this secret. We are in the process right now of doing something that I've termed planeticide, the deliberate killing of an entire planet with malice aforethought through greed and stupidity and power. All the damage we're going to see in a few minutes, totally avoidable. Every bit of it since the 1920s at least. And we can prove this.
I'm afraid that the term planeticide is all too real. The ecocide doesn't really say it. We are in the process of destroying the biosphere, destroying a habitable world for certainly the majority of the animals on the planet. I'm an older guy. I won't be around to see the worst of this, but I have not just trepidation, but terror at what's going to be faced by my son's generation and the generations that come after him.
When someone asks me how bad is the crisis, I kind of don't know where to begin. Because what does that even mean? Does it mean what is the threat to humanity? Have we reached some kind of tipping point? There are certain things that get under my skin or that especially alarm me. And one of them is the insect holocaust, for lack of a better word. The precipitous decline in the number of insects, the number of species, the total biomass of insects. A lot of studies put that decline at 80%. When I was a child, when we went on a long drive, especially in the summer, like we'd have to have the windshield wipers on from time to time to clear off the bug splatter. Like you just don't have that anymore. Insects are like the foundation of the terrestrial food chain. Like you can't have a thriving ecosystem without thriving insects.
That this is the 6th great extinction that's happening on the planet, and it's 100% man-made, all of it. We have to all awaken, because of what's happened, I think we're like a frog being boiled slowly. And suddenly we're going to wake up and find out, it's too late. 150 species every day go extinct. Now, these aren't all animals, they're all kinds of species.
The planet has been dying at human hands for a long time. A naturalist I like, J.B. McKinnon, he calls the world a 10% world as kind of a poetic expression of how much life has declined. So there's maybe 10% of the whales that there were 500 years ago, and the seabirds and the wetlands and the mangrove swamps, and the fish biomass. We don't even know what we have lost, although in some level we feel it. This is part of the despair, part of the alienation and the anguish that sensitive people feel.
Ice caps are melting. The oceans are certainly going to rise. They could rise as much as 20 feet if we have the big ones melt.
This is all the way back in 1958. And there was a full-page color ad in Life magazine. Everybody was reading Life magazine at the time. And it's by an oil company which was the predecessor of Exxon, which was called Humble. Each day, Humble supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier. Here they're bragging about it in 1958. So this company gets rebranded as Exxon in the 1970s. And in July 1977, they have a meeting inside Exxon headquarters where their chief scientist, James Black, is showing slides that are warning that burning fossil fuels are going to eventually endanger all of humanity. They know this in 1977. Present thinking holds that man has a time window of 15 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies might become critical. Well, those 15 years were up in the early 1990s.
Look at this. How long ago was it recognized that this was a disaster? Senior scientist Exxon, 45 years ago. And actually it was known before then. This is insanity. This is a civilization gone mad.
These companies have really not been held accountable. We've lived in a fossil fuel economy now for more than 100 years. And it's just been accelerating. The amount of wealth has been increasing. You have situations now where the head of ExxonMobil goes on to become the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson under President Trump.
And I'm an environmentalist. A lot of people don't understand that. I think I know more about the environment than most people.
So there is really very little accountability that exists.
Many scientists, such as myself, have discovered that there are very concerted, well-oiled machines that provide false information, even to scientific and academic programs. It's called Capture, where they try to rationalize away this problem and everything's fine.
One company, Exxon alone, has funded more than 40 different groups to keep alive its campaign to deny the worst impacts of climate change. There was a guy named Martin Hoffert, and he's a professor of physics at New York University, a consultant to Exxon for their climate modeling during the 1980s. And he said this:
the advertisements that Exxon ran in major newspapers raising doubt about climate change were contradicted by the scientific work we had done and continued to do. Exxon was publicly promoting views that its own scientists knew were wrong, and we knew that because we were the major group working on this. This was immoral and has greatly set back efforts to address climate change.
Here's a case where the Canadian government ordered the scientists not to disclose the extent of it. So what you get in the media is a very sanitized version of this problem, which many people believe we may have already gone over the edge of the red line, how far we can go without a safe return to a sustainable civilization.
China is the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter by a huge margin. And if there's anything clear so far coming out of this year's Communist Party Congress, it's that coal is having a bit of a revival in the world's second largest economy. A senior energy official said China will give full play to coal as ballast in the country's energy mix.
Why are we digging stuff up out of the ground when we haven't needed to burn coal since about the 1920, 1930 time period? Here's your solar panels. I had to replace my solar panels with more, and they all end up in a landfill and they're toxic. You know, we're working in a paradigm, whether it be fossil fuels or what is being proposed as new energy, that isn't going to work.
I'm certainly not opposed to renewable technologies, but you know, they are dependent on weather. They're dependent on how much wind there is in an area, or they're able to harness of the sun. And they cost an awful lot to bring up to speed.
No environmentalist wants to see vast landscapes converted to biofuels, or pit mines to mine silver and cobalt and lithium, wind turbines that kill birds and mar the landscape. This isn't what we signed up for. But this is what happens when we abdicate our relational care for every place and ecosystem and being on Earth and transfer that onto yet another quantitative cost-benefit paradigm.
And you have lithium fields. The amount of pollution from these lithium mining operations for lithium-ion batteries in your Tesla, not to mention they catch fire periodically. Now, fair enough, I'm an emergency and trauma doctor. Gasoline cars catch fire more. I can tell you some horror stories, which I'm sure you don't want to hear. And then we have this whole morass of how we're living, you know, on wires that we haven't needed. And so the entire system is set up to benefit a relatively small number of global oligarchs and financial interests that we absolutely have to say enough. They've had 150 years to do this.
If we want to live among other life in the future and not in a concrete hellscape where we retreat into virtual worlds to compensate for the loss of what is alive, then we have to change our ways. And we have to start acting from our care for life.
Most of you know that there are these nanoparticulate plastics that are in the entire food chain. They cause cancer, they disrupt hormones, they damage your brain. And why? Well, if we had quote-unquote free energy systems from what we're going to describe as zero-point energy field, you would never have to have anything wasted because you have 100% recycling because the cost of the energy would be zero. And then we have all these famines happening around the world because of the absolute social injustice of a system that is driven by greed and scarce resources. When, as Tesla pointed out, there's an infinite amount of energy to be tapped in what has now been quantified as the zero-point energy field. How do you tap it? Now, mainstream science says it can't be tapped. It's there theoretically. Not true. And you're going to find out how untrue that is.
International Panel on Climate Change, which issues annual reports about the dire state of things that we're facing. It says in their latest report that over the next decade alone, between 32 million and 130-some million people are going to be driven into poverty because of the changing climate in their countries. 3 billion people, almost half the world's population, has no way to cook their food. They have no way to heat. But what they're doing, they have to survive, is cutting down the rainforest and cutting down the scrub and shrubs in the desert. And you have what's called desertification, where you have the growth of deserts going on exponentially. You can take maps from 40 years ago and now and just see the growth of this dead zone. Why? You have 3 billion people that don't even have, even if they had access to fossil fuels, they don't have access. This is how they're living.
It's not only that 3 billion people don't have access to energy sources, it's also that their way of life is under constant assault by our own, primarily through the financial system that imposes debt through development loans and other mechanisms on most of the world, who then must, in order to meet the debt payments, must convert their environment into commodities and their time and energy into labor for the global marketplace. So if you don't include those kinds of issues, and you're only talking about let's bring more energy to the world so that we can raise them up to be like ourselves. Come on, it's not working. Being like ourselves is not working. Look at the depression, look at the suicide, look at the addiction, look at the obesity, look at the despair. This is not a fit destination to evangelize throughout the world. We need some humility here.
The dire emergency in East Africa, the drought there exacerbating the hunger crisis. As many as 20 million people could be starving by the middle of this year, half of them children.
I firmly believe there can be no peace on this planet without justice. And there can be no justice when half the population of the world is required to live in abject poverty. It's a direct result of the world's energy system. So I always liken this, we're living in this sort of the Truman Show. It's a perfect metaphor for the world we're living in now where, the people who are saying we need more oil, gas, and coal until we get something to replace it, they're right. Look what's happening all over the world. On the other hand, the people who say we can't just keep drill, baby, drill and burning oil and gas and coal because we're destroying the biosphere. And they're right. Now, when both sides are right and both sides are wrong, someone's been had. We've been had by people who want to deceive us and think that we're actually having a legitimate debate about energy and the environment. We are not. We're all Jim Carrey living in this Truman Show of a construct. So everyone's saying, well, we don't have enough fossil fuels coming out, and the density of energy from solar and wind isn't enough, so let's build more of these. Well, then you're stuck with 1 million years of toxic, life-killing waste from nuclear reactors.
Greenhouse gas emissions would only decrease, according to a recent study, by 4% if we double the amount of energy that we're getting from nuclear power by 2050. Well, that's not a very good statistic to think about.
Most people think when nuclear power plant is running that you're somehow getting energy from the atom directly. No. What you're doing is splitting the atom, as it were, creating a lot of heat that boils water, heats water, it turns a steam engine, like a choo-choo train in 1849 coming out to the gold rush in California. That's all a nuclear power plant is, except they're stuck with 1 million years of waste. And this is the other problem. The distribution of the power from the point that you have the primary source, by the time you generate it, transmit it through the inefficient transmission lines, and then you're wiring in your device or your home, you've lost at least 66%. So 66% of the energy is completely wasted. So here's your energy grid. 12% is a new renewable. The rest is the old system. So if you plug in your electric car, 88% of the power is coming from gas and oil and coal.
The entire world is running on an energy paradigm of scarcity, meaning that there's never more energy than we generate, and we lose that energy as we move it around and deploy it in different ways. And so energy is expensive, and energy is difficult to get to remote areas. And that energy is important because it's inputs in growing food, and it's inputs in manufacturing, and it's inputs in the economy, and it's inputs in all of these things that make people's lives better and that solve the problems that desperately need to be solved on the planet right now. Over unity is a very simple idea. It's that you're getting more energy out of something than you're putting into it. And according to mainstream science, that's impossible.
What free energy devices suggest is that there is a limitless supply of usable energy that's always coming into reality, and that we're not living in a universe of fundamental scarcity.
So over unity is more than just a breakthrough that's going to live its life in a technical paper. It's not that. It's really the ability of humans to liberate themselves.
Yes, there is a history
a long history of over-unity systems. For example, Nikola Tesla had one. Basically, his big magnifying transformer that he had on Long Island was such an over-unity system. He got the entire Earth itself in resonance. Everything going on is feeding energy into the Earth starts to feed energy into that wave that he created. So he gets a lot more energy in his resonant wave fed from outside, from the environment in the interior of the Earth. His idea was you could then put in a tap on it anywhere else on the world and extract it free. And of course, J.P. Morgan's take on that was, that's foolish, you can't put a meter on it. So that actually doomed much of Tesla's career at that point when Morgan found out that Tesla, was going to produce the energy freely.
But I love this quote. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Now, the reason he said that is that when you use what's called a very high voltage system, you can tap in to what Professor Casimir called the 0-point energy field. Some people call it the quantum vacuum. Other people, like Professor Dirac, modestly called it the Dirac Sea. And we just tested a device last month in the Arizona desert, you'll see in a moment, that is based on that.
Nobody is really trying to get, for example, over unity, more energy out of something than you put in, because it's assumed that that is impossible. Well, that might be impossible, but only if you don't really understand the fabric of reality itself.
They just can't believe it, especially engineers, because I know how we were taught, right? There is no vacuum energy. You're just a kook when you think so, right? If they took a little more physics, they would go, well, maybe.
It's not a small thing. It's not a matter of finding proof for some technology, for some invention, and convincing everybody of it. You can't convince somebody of something that so totally contradicts their basic assumptions about the universe.
But what if there's a pool of energy available to us that we didn't even think was possible because we're operating on these 100-plus-year-old assumptions? We can't find this excess energy simply because no one's looking for it.
So-called empty space isn't really empty at all. It's actually full of energy. So instead of being like kind of a quiet, empty lake, it's more like the froth at the base of a waterfall or something. But when you go to look at the numbers, you find out that there's enough energy in the volume of a coffee cup to, say, evaporate all the world's oceans if you could get it all of it.
And here we have a car from 1921 running without a plug. Now look at this old car. And it was pulling energy out of, they just said, out of the environment. They couldn't quantify what, but they had the correct frequency, and this had a battery and some wiring, and it was running around without being plugged in. Memo to Tesla Motors, go and research this and get rid of your plug-ins. And this is one of my favorite, 1902. A farmer and engineer named Stubblefield with Tesla, he had something they called the Earth battery, or the Stubblefield battery, and it had rods going into the Earth and some wiring, and it was picking up this magnetic flux field of the planet, and he was running his farm, and Tesla was there with him. 1902. So when I say 100 years, lost century, no.
I do not wish to talk about it myself, but I've been a victim of quite a bit of suppression. So has any other legitimate researcher in this area.
The government is protecting the interest of the oil industry because they're in bed together. Tremendous amounts of contributions for politicians come from these huge companies, and these huge companies have been covering up for years what we're doing to the planet.
Today, we don't have so much big kingdoms. We have cartels. We have a whole set of cartels in an area, interlocking corporations, and behind this, we have a few people who are quite wealthy and who own most things. Any time we have a very powerful cartel or set of people that control a lot of things, that resists any means of changing its inflow of control and its inflow of funds and money and its power. You know, everybody's trying to be the big monkey. It's really as simple as that.
Here we have all the methods. Some of these are common sense, but every one of these are ones I have encountered and investigated personally with geniuses, engineering geniuses and physics geniuses, but strategically impaired inventors. Black shelving. So someone comes along, they offer you $20 million for your device, it's a corporation, they put it on a shelf. Boom. National security orders. We're going to show you one from a man we just met with. Patent seizures. Financial entanglements from investors because they're doing their whole business in legal strategy.